Today we are going to be looking at how to help you get the most out of your research skills. So we're going to be talking all about how to use the library and how to construct searches in a way that will help you to have an efficient process for finding information for your assignments while you're at university. Yeah. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge, celebrate, and pay my deepest respects to the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people of the Canberra region, and to all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work, and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. So a bit of housekeeping for today's Zoom session. Please feel free to have your video on if you would like. It is nice to see other faces so that it's not like I'm talking to an empty room. Please keep your microphone muted at all times during the session so that we don't get any weird feedback or background noise. If you would like to ask any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat as we go. I will try and keep an eye on it as much as possible, and there will be a couple of instances where I will pause and answer any questions. If you think your question is a little bit more complex or you would like to unmute and ask it verbally, then we will have time at the end for that. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to start with a brief introduction to the ANU library for any of you who are not already familiar. We're going to start by talking about the research process. We'll discuss how to find information, how to actually structure a search, and how to evaluate your sources once you have found them. So researching your assignments and essays is not just a one and done activity. It is actually a process. And if you follow these steps that I'm going to lay out in today's session, you're going to find it much, much easier to actually get the answers that you need in a timely fashion without wasting time. So why is it important to learn about research practices? Well, the first thing and the most important thing is that if you're able to find good quality information for your assignments, it gives your arguments more credibility. And most of the time, the assignments that you'll be doing at university will require you to make an argument. So you will need to come up with a thesis, something that you want to argue, a point that you want to make. And if you can find good quality information for those arguments, it gives them more credibility. And at the end of the day, that also gets you higher marks. And more than that, it's important to have these good skills out in the workforce and in your life as well, not just while you're at university. So having these skills, being able to locate good quality information and to evaluate that information are actually going to set you up for your future career and will actually give you an edge over people and applicants for jobs who don't have these skills, regardless of what field you're working in. So what do we mean by the research process? Well, it tends to be really easy, specifically these days because of Google, to fall into the trap that research is a linear process. So that means that you have a need for information, you create your search strategy, and the database retrieves a perfect list of relevant documents for you. Unfortunately, research doesn't actually work like this, and that's why we call it a process. It's not as simple as deciding what information you need, looking for that information, and having that information available for you. If you are doing good research and you are having good research practices, you will find that your search strategies actually evolve the more you learn about your topic. Good research is what we call iterative, which means that as you learn more, you develop your research and your reading and your research question based on that new information. So you might start with a research question, but you will be expected to develop and refine that question as you read more material and learn more about your topic. And this is going to lead you to refine and clarify your search terms and strategies. And it's very, very normal to change your keywords multiple times before you find ones that actually work for you or that are returning the results that at the end of the day are actually what you need. So it's important to remember that this process is one that goes around and around, not one that goes from start to finish. So one of the key parts of this process is what we call background reading. Now, I like to think of the research process as like building a house. So what's the most important first step in building a house? Well, it's having a strong foundation. And the background reading that you do is what forms this foundation. Now, if your foundation is full of big holes and cracks and gaps in your knowledge, then your house, which is your argument, is going to fall down later on. So what is background reading? Well, background reading is the process of broad general reading on your research topic before you even start searching. So background reading can consist of material provided by your lecturer, so your course readings and things like that. It could be textbooks, or it could be just doing a very general search in the library catalogue on your topic and skimming a few of the articles that come up. Doing this broad research means that you're able to identify gaps where you don't have enough knowledge or to find topics to research. And if you have done really good background reading and you have a really sound understanding of your topic, when you start to structure your argument, it will be stronger and it will have better foundations as a result. So it's really, really important to do background reading before you start researching. So we're going to have a look at a bit of an example question now. So we're going to imagine that we have been given this essay question to write an essay about by your lecturer. So you've been asked to examine the impact of social media on identity development in young people. In your analysis, consider the opportunities and challenges presented by social media platforms, the role of self-presentation and identity construction, and the influence on social connectedness and social support networks. So, with this question, I want you to try and pick out the key concepts. So what are the key ideas in this question that will start to form the basis of your search? So I'm going to get you all to go to www.menti.com and type in the code 39760318. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. And then I'll go back to the question. And I want you to put into the Menti quiz what you think the key concepts are from our example question. Okay, so here we have our word cloud from the responses that we've been given. So we can see that the responses that are in bigger text are the ones that were came through more frequently. And so correctly, a lot of you have identified that social media, social connectedness, young people, and identity development are some of those key concepts. So that's fantastic. So those are definitely some of the kind of words that we want to be looking out for. Things like connectedness, identity development, youth is a really good one. So that's one that wasn't actually mentioned in the question, but is a really good keyword to use. Some of the ones that I would say we maybe wouldn't use in a search, and don't worry if you have answered some of these not so great keywords, because that's what we're here for, is to teach you how to do this more effectively. So some of the ones that we might not have used are things like impact and challenges. Particularly those two stand out to me as they're the kind of words that we wouldn't actually want to put in a search, because those are the words that are implied in the way that we construct a search. So if you find an article that has the keywords social media and young people in it, you could generally assume that that article is going to be talking about the impact of one or the other, because there's no other reason to be discussing them in the same context. As well, things like challenges are very vague. That's not actually getting to the heart of what we are asking in this question. So if we go back to the slides, whoops. Back to the slides. So here, these are the key concepts that I would pick out. So these are the main ideas: social media, identity development, young people, self-presentation, and identity construction. Now, the reason that we would use these particular terms as opposed to some of the other words such as impact and challenges and things like that are because these are the ideas that are central to what the question is asking. Words like challenges tend to be, they could be referring to anything. So if you find an article with the word challenges in it, it could be talking about literally anything. So it's not really a useful term. We want to find the questions that are the terms that are key to this question and that really get to the heart of what information we are looking for. So that's the first step in starting to construct a search, is to identify what those key concepts are. What are the ideas without which this would not make sense? And so once we've done that, the next step is to start looking at related terms. So this is basically the same words that have a different words or a different phrase, but have a same or a similar meaning to our key concept. So the reason that we need to find these related terms is that not everybody refers to a concept in the same way necessarily. So we saw someone had the great keyword of youth come up in our Menti cloud. And although youth wasn't specifically mentioned in the question, it is a really good way to refer to young people. Another example might be adolescence. You're getting to the same concept, but you're using a slightly different word. And this is really important because if you don't include these related terms, you might be missing out on a ton of great articles just because they use slightly different vocabulary. So a really good example of this is social media. If we just search for social media, there might be articles out there that use the nomenclature of social network, or who might be talking about Facebook or Twitter specifically, rather than, I suppose I shouldn't say Twitter anymore, should I? I should say X, but who may be talking about a specific social media site rather than social media in general. And if you don't include these kind of terms in your searches, then you may be missing out on some really great articles. So another example might be our identity concept. And so we may think, okay, identity is a pretty clear-cut word, but some articles that might be talking about self-identification or identity construction would still fall under this concept of identity. So the reason we'll see a little bit later when we're talking about constructing a search, why we kind of create these baskets for concepts. But generally, when you're starting to think of these keywords, you should think of them in these kind of categories of like, this is the first concept, and here's a range of different words that connect to that concept, and here's a separate concept that I want to search for as well, and here's the terms that relate to that. So if that all seems a little complicated, don't worry too much, because we're going to go into a little bit more detail in that in a bit. So what this really comes down to is that it's really important to think before you search. Before you jump into a database and you start throwing keywords around, it's really important to make sure that you know exactly what you're looking for so that you can have you can come up with thoughtful and relevant keywords. So a really good way to approach this is to break this down into these three questions. So firstly, think about what you already know. And this might be information that you know from your course readings or from your lectures, or it might be stuff that you just know yourself from your life or your own experiences. So in this example, thinking about our question about social media, some things that we might already know about social media is that the presence of social media has increased people's access to information, and we might know that young people's identity development can be impacted by outside forces. So these are things that we know maybe from our lectures or from the news or whatever. And once you've thought, okay, what do I know about this topic? And this is where our background reading can come into play. So that can be stuff that we've learned from our background reading. We then need to think, what do I need to know? So where are the gaps in my knowledge? What is the information that I actually need to answer the question that I am asking? So this might be things like, okay, we know that social media is very prevalent, and we know that identity development can be impacted by outside forces, but we don't know, does social media have an actual impact on identity development? And we might not know if increased access to information changes how identity develops. And then from that, you can boil down your key concepts. So this is a really useful technique that you can use if your question that you've been given by your lecturer seems a little overwhelming and you're not sure where to start or where to find those key concepts. Or it could be that sometimes lecturers will ask you to come up with your own question. So you may be given a topic that you need to write about, but you need to come up with your own question, your own research topic. So breaking it down like this into these steps can be really helpful to help you articulate what it is you actually need to find. Another thing that's really important to do before you start searching is to think about what kind of information you're actually looking for. Now, the reason this is important is because different types of information might be collected by different groups and therefore might be found in different places. So what I mean by this is that library databases are not always going to be the be all and end all. They may not have the information that you're looking for, depending on what you're trying to find. Similarly, you can't just go to Google for everything because a lot of the information that you need will only be found in scholarly databases. So it's just a quick step to add in. Think about what kind of information you're looking for and who might be collecting it. So a quick example of this. Here we have, we might be looking for information on the effect of social media on identity construction. So what are we probably looking for here? Well, this is where we'll be looking at that kind of scholarly research. We'll be looking for peer-reviewed articles. So who would be collecting that information? Well, academic researchers in the field of social sciences, humanities, potentially anthropology, maybe psychology. And so where would you find that information? Well, you're going to be looking in academic journals and databases, specifically those with a social sciences or psychology-based approach. On the other hand, if you're looking for information on types of social media or statistics on social media use, you won't find that in scholarly research. So you'd actually be better off in that case to go looking at grey literature, government reports, or legislation. And that kind of information might instead be gathered by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the CSIRO, or independent think tanks. So in that case, you would be looking at government websites or using Google to do your searching. This is super important because if you're looking in the wrong place for the wrong kind of information, you're going to be wasting your time. And you don't have a lot of time as students. You have a lot of assignments to do. You have a lot of readings to do. So it's really important to make sure that you're being effective and targeted with your searches. So once we've worked out what information we actually need, it is time to start searching. So we've thought a little bit about where we need to go to find our information, but There's a whole range of different databases available for you to use, especially while you're here as a student. And it can be really tempting to fall into the habit of just using one database or just using Google Scholar or Super Search to do your research. However, this is a poor way to do research, and it's going to make life harder for you. And the reason for this is that databases are a lot like streaming services. So, for example, we all know that if you want to watch The Mandalorian, you need to have Disney Plus. But if you want to watch The Witcher, you need to have Netflix. I'm probably going to have to change my example now. Thank you, Netflix, for ruining The Witcher, but you get the picture. So databases are just like streaming services. If you just use one database, there's going to be a whole range of different content that you're actually missing out on. I'm just seeing there's a question in the chat from Marjorie. What is grey literature? Grey literature is a big bucket of stuff. So there's not really an easy answer to that, but it basically means literature that has not been peer reviewed or published in an academic journal, but which is still tends to be of a more scholarly nature. So things that we could put in the grey literature basket includes things like cases and legislation. It includes stuff like government reports, reports from companies like Deloitte or Roy Morgan, things like that. So it's quite a big bucket, and it's kind of very vague, unfortunately, but it basically means reports and things like that have done research and have provided a certain degree of sort of scholarly work, but which are not peer-reviewed academic literature that's been published in a scholarly database. So hopefully that makes sense. So we need to use different databases because databases have different content. And if you are just looking at, say, Scopus, which will say, is Disney Plus, you're going to be missing out on all of the amazing stuff that Netflix has. So it's really important to make sure that you use a wide range of different databases. So we have two broad collections of different source types. So most of the information that you'll be accessing falls into one of these two camps. The first of these is what we call scholarly sources. And most of the information that you're going to be using for research will be what we call scholarly sources. So these include things like peer-reviewed academic literature, books published by subject experts, and research papers and theses. So these are sort of the academic side of information. So this is information that has been produced by people who have academic qualifications and which is usually published in a scholarly manner. So that's through academic publishers or through journals. Now, peer-reviewed academic literature is considered the gold standard of scholarly sources because it means that that information has been looked at and checked by somebody who is an expert in that field, and they have said, yep, this is good research. However, not everything that is scholarly has been peer reviewed. So things like research papers and theses or even books are very rarely peer reviewed. That doesn't mean that they're not good sources. It just means they haven't had that highly rigorous process of review. The other camp is what we call non-scholarly sources. So these are materials that are not produced by academics or subject matter experts. So these include things like magazine articles and newspapers, blogs and websites, and videos and books created by what we call lay people, which means non-experts. So non-scholarly sources can be good sources of information and they can be used to support your arguments, but they must be used more carefully and you must make sure that you thoroughly evaluate the information before you use them. So the really important thing to remember here is that non-scholarly does not mean it's bad. It just means you need to do more evaluation. And we're going to talk about evaluating sources at the end of today's session. Got another question in the chat from Lynette, who has asked, can you search for specific newspapers? Yes, you can. We have a couple of databases, in particular one called Factiva, which is a newspaper database. So it is specifically news sources. So you can search in that using keywords, and you can narrow your search to a specific newspaper. There's also some tricks that you can use in Google to search across a particular news website. So if you wanted to search, say, for example, the ABC News website, you could do that using Google. And we have a couple of other newspaper databases like ProQuest Newsstream and things like that that provide access to specific newspapers. So yes, you absolutely can. And newspapers can be a great source of information for research. You just have to make sure that you are aware of any potential biases. So yeah, newspapers are a great example of a non-scholarly source that can be really, really valuable and can provide a lot of great information, but you do need to be a little bit more careful and do a little bit more evaluation than you would if you were using a scholarly source. Now, if this all seems a little bit complicated, don't worry. The library has a collection of subject guides, which are curated lists of recommended resources for different areas of study. So if you hop onto the library website, you can go to your college or faculties. So we have sort of, as you can see on the screen, we've sort of got the broad categories of arts and social sciences, law, health and medicine. And if you click on those links, it will take you to a much more granular and broken down list of different subject areas. And if you click into there, you can actually find a list of journals, databases, books, and so on that will help give you a starting place for where you might start to look for particular types of information. So once we've done all of that pre-work, and although it takes a long time to explain, it doesn't usually take that long to actually do, it's time to start creating a search. Now, it's really, really important to remember when you start searching that databases are not Google. Google has clever algorithms that let you ask it questions the way that you would a person. So you can say, okay, Google, what's the weather going to be today? And Google will say, oh, it's going to be 24 and sunny. It knows how to respond to what we call a natural language search. So natural language search is when you type in a question the way that you would speak to another person or in a sort of conversational manner. And Google is able to pass that information and give you a response. Academic databases do not allow natural language searching. So you need to be able to speak to them in their language. So if you go into a database like Scopus and you say, hey, Scopus, I need an article about wind turbines, it is going to have no idea what you are talking about. Databases speak like computers. They do not speak like people. So we need to learn how to speak like a database so that we can create a search that it can understand. Yes, I am recording the lecture. Okay. So how to speak like a computer? Well, we use these things called Boolean operators, which is a very library jargony term, but it basically refers to a set of symbols and words that we can use to communicate what we want to a database in a way that it is able to understand. So the first of these is and. We use and to connect different concepts. So when we're thinking about our example question, you have your social media bucket and you have your identity bucket as your two sort of key concepts. You use and to connect those two. And so basically what it tells the database is that we only want articles that have both of those terms in it. So it narrows your search down to make sure that the papers you're getting are actually relevant. The next one is or. So we use or to connect up those related terms that we thought about. So if you have your social media and social network concepts, If you connect those two together, you do it using OR, and it tells the database, I don't mind whether this article refers to social media or social networks. Either are fine, so give me either. So it broadens your search. Quotation marks are extremely important. These allow us to do what we call phrase searching. So phrase searching is when you have a concept that has more than one word. So for example, social media, if you just type that into a database without the quotation marks, the database isn't going to recognize that social media is a single concept. It will think it's two separate words because databases are stupid. So it will just find any article that has the word social in it and any article that has word media in it, and it will think, right, that's what you wanted. So to tell it that we actually want social media as a single phrase, we use those quotation marks, and we use that anytime you have a concept that includes more than one word. And the last one is kind of an added bonus extra. You probably don't need to worry about this one until you're getting into slightly more advanced searching. But this is what we call a truncation symbol. So we use the asterisk symbol on our keyboard. And basically what the truncation symbol does is it allows you to search for alternate word endings. So essentially, if you want to capture a multiple different word endings. So if you're searching, say, for influencers and you wanted to search for the word influence and also influencer and also influencers, you could put the truncation symbol there and it will search for those multiple word endings. So it's a little bit of a more complicated searching technique, but it can be useful in certain circumstances. So basically, the two that you really need to worry about are these and or operators. So the important thing to remember is that and creates a narrower search because it's only searching for articles that contain all of your key concepts. Or, on the other hand, makes your search broader because it searches for any of your related terms. So usually when we are constructing a search, we're using both of these operators in conjunction to make sure that we aren't missing any articles that could be relevant, but also we are knocking out anything that isn't relevant. So what this ends up looking like is something like this. In our first bucket, our first concept, we have our social media concept. So this is our first idea in our search. And so you can see here, we've got our social media and its related terms, and we're using OR to connect each of those related terms. Then we use our AND operator to connect that to our second concept around identity. And so here again, we have identity, and then we have our related terms connected by OR. And then we can go on and add more concepts. Now, it's important to remember that the more concepts you add, the less results you'll get because you'll be getting more and more specific articles. So if you do include 3 different concepts and you find that you aren't getting any results, you can try removing one and doing a bit of a broader search. So what this looks like in practice is something like this. So we've got our social media concept. We link it to our identity concept using the AND operator, and we link it to our generational concept using AND again. And so this is actually what you would type into your search bar in a database. And it doesn't look like much to us, or it looks very confusing and complicated. But to the database, that is database language. So it is saying that it will return any article that contains the term social media or TikTok, along with the terms identity or identity development and Zoomers or Generation Z. And so that's how we start to construct a search strategy. We got another question there from Marjorie. Can you use the asterisk inside quotation marks? Depends on the database. Some of the more I guess the more sophisticated databases will allow you to do that. It will be able to recognize that you are truncating a word inside a phrase search. Less sophisticated databases, and by that I'm kind of talking about library search, Google Scholar, and things like that, they will probably get confused because they read the quotation marks as asking for an exact phrase. And so the truncation symbol will confuse it, or it will just ignore it. So yeah, if you're using a sort of a real scholarly database like Scopus or Web of Science or something like that, you should be able to use the truncation symbol within the quotation marks fine. If you're using library search, Google Scholar or something like that, then you're probably better off to try and avoid that if possible. All right, so now we have thought through our research process. We've decided what information we need, formulated our research question, and constructed a search. And now we have a bunch of results. The last thing that we need to do before we start incorporating those results into our research paper or our essay, or whatever it may be, is to evaluate those sources. And this is one of the most important parts of the research process, and it's a skill that a lot of people are lacking. I think we all saw during the COVID pandemic that a lot of people's capacity to evaluate information effectively is not great. And if you've ever had, an uncle or a grandparent or something send you some patently ridiculous information on Facebook, where it's very clear that it's not come from a reputable source, then you've seen somebody who's not able to evaluate information effectively. So it's really, really important that you understand this evaluation process. And to make it a little bit easier, we have an acronym, and we use the TRAP test. So the TRAP test helps us to decide if a source is trustworthy enough to use in a research project or in an essay, or even just to believe. So the first thing we need to think about is timeliness. So this is thinking about when the information was published and is it still up to date? Now, this can be a tricky one because there aren't really any hard and fast rules about it, and it really depends on what kind of research you are doing, what your research topic is, and what field that you're in as to what counts as a timely piece of information. Obviously, if you are studying history, then you may be looking at extremely old historical sources and things like that. If you're in computing and cybernetics, you probably want the most up-to-date information because it's a field that's changing very, very quickly. Generally speaking, for most academic research, we would consider 5 to 10 years as sort of the golden period for something that you could include in your research without having to worry too much about whether it's become out of date or superseded. The really important thing to think about is if this is research that was done 10 or more years ago, has that research been disproven? Has it been built upon? Has it been extended in the time since? Has our understanding changed? Our society is moving on at a rapid pace, and a lot of the time, information or research that was done 20 years ago no longer really has a lot of relevance in today's society because things have changed quite dramatically. So think about timeliness first. The next thing we need to think about is relevance. So this is about who is the intended audience, does it answer the research question, and is it from a reliable source? So it's important to remember that now you are part of a scholarly audience. And so sources that are written for a non-scholarly audience or for a layperson audience are probably not quite as relevant as they used to be. You need to be looking at scholarly sources or information that's produced for a scholarly audience, unless you're specifically looking for something that's talking about current events or, news sources or something along those lines. And it's really important to make sure that it answers your research question. So we did all that work at the beginning, thinking about what information do we actually need to answer that question. And that's where this criteria falls into. It can be very easy to sort of fall down a rabbit hole of, oh, that's really interesting. Or, you know, we've all been down the Wikipedia rabbit hole, right? Where you just look at something and you're like, oh, that's really cool. And then you click on a link and you're like, oh, that's really interesting. And then 5 minutes later, you're miles away from where you started. It's really important when you're doing research that you consider if that piece of information, that source is actually answering your research question, because it will weaken your argument to include information that isn't relevant. The next one is authority and accuracy. So this is about who created the source, whether their credentials, sorry, the lights are going out around me. I've been here too long. So who created this source? Are they an expert in this area? Do they have any credentials? So authority is really important to remember that it's not just about people having a PhD or being really well educated. So somebody could have a PhD in, say, biochemistry and be an incredibly intelligent person who is very well read and very well educated. But if they've written a paper on, say, social psychology, for an example, they are a biochemist. They are not a social psychologist. And so they are actually not an authority on social psychology. So it's really important when you're looking at authority to understand if that person is actually an expert in that area, or whether they are just an expert in something else. And then accuracy is thinking about, can this information be verified in other sources, or is there enough evidence to back up their claims? So somebody could be doing really groundbreaking research, and it could be, you know, a source that, you know, nobody's done that research before, so there's no way to verify that information. But then you need to be thinking about the design of their study, the methodology. Have they appropriately provided the evidence and the data to support their reasoning, or do you think that they have jumped to conclusions or not really considered the whole picture? So it's really, this is about making sure that what you are including is actually true, and not just something that has been made up. And the last one is purpose or point of view. So this is thinking about bias. Why was this information created? Is it trying to sell you something, or is it trying to convince you of a certain point of view? So this really comes into play with non-scholarly sources, but can also, sometimes research papers can be paid for by, say, you know, a good example is tobacco companies paying for research papers on how tobacco doesn't cause lung cancer. And obviously then those sources have a bias, and are therefore not good sources to use. So thinking about why this information was created, is it trying to convince you of something? Is it trying to sell you something? Is really important as well. So that's the trap test. We're going to have a really quick activity now. Hopefully, the faster you guys participate in the activity, the quicker we can all go home. So I want you to look at these two sources, and I want you to tell me which one you think is a trap and therefore not a good source to use in an assignment. So you can either unmute and tell me which one you think it is, or you can just pop in the chat. So which one of these two sources, left or right, do you think is not a good source to use in your assignment? Okay, we've got a couple saying the right. All right. So yes, the agreement is generally that the one on the right is the one that is not a good source, and that is correct. So the left-hand source has authority. It is a website with a .gov.au URL. Therefore, it's an Australian government website and is more likely to have correct and non-biased information. Whereas the one on the right is a blog post. And without any further information on this person's credentials, this is a less reliable source of information. Therefore, it is a trap. All right, one more. Which one of these two sources do we think is a trap? If you want to elaborate on why you think so, please feel free to do so as well. All right, so everyone seems to agree mostly, except for Sarah, that the one on the right is a trap. But even though the Pew Research Centre is a reliable source, that source is actually from 2019. So although 2019 may not seem that long ago, in terms of social media, 4 years is an eternity. Even if we just look at what has happened in terms of Twitter in the past, 6 months, there's been a massive shift. And so when we are looking at something that is as topical and as fast moving as social media, 2019 is a little bit outdated. On the right, we have currency and authority. So the source is from earlier this year, so it's really up to date. And Emerald Insight is an academic database, so it's more likely to contain reliable information. So it's actually the one on the left that was a trap. Okay, so well done, everybody. Thank you for coming along. Quickly before we leave, on the library website, we have a heap of resources available to help you. So I mentioned the subject guides earlier. We also have the Ask a Librarian box that you can see on the website there. That is a great first place to go if you have any questions. You can access our chat there. You can look at our FAQs and you can send us an email. It also provides links to allow you to book a research consultation with a subject specialist librarian such as myself. So if you have a specific research need and you need help, feel free to book an appointment there. And you can also, of course, search across the library collection by using the search box on the homepage. It does look a little bit different now. We've just updated the website. I need to replace this screenshot. But easy to search and a really good place to start. So thank you so much for coming. Please do remember the library is always here to help. There is no question too stupid. I'd love if you could scan the QR code or go to that link and give us feedback on the session. We've just started running this session this semester, so we'd love to have your feedback on what you thought. Is there anything we can improve? Was this a good time? Did you like the online format? Would you rather do it in person? So on and so forth. So please feel free to do that. I'm going to answer some questions now. If you don't have any other questions and you don't want to hang around, please feel free to head off. Thank you so much for coming. If you'd like to hear the answer to the questions, or if you have a question yourself, please feel free to hang around for a few more minutes.